Okay, so our second part is dedicated to more, for me, complex question of the history of analytic and Chinese philosophy. And as I told previously, our first presenter in this session will be Robin Wang from Loyola Marymount University, Los Angeles. She's professor of philosophy and director of Asian Pacific Studies at Loyola Marymount University. And she specializes in Chinese philosophy and has worked extensively on the representation and role of women in Chinese thought and culture. Robin, please, you may start.
Thank you. Thank you very much to have me. Really honored to participate this conference. Actually, I really enjoyed the question Canons of philosophy when I prepared this talk. So I like to share with you and let me see, yeah, share. Okay. So my talk today, basically, I want to talk about 3 points. So basically now we move from European to Asia, particularly China. So 3 points. One, I was thinking, one's making of Confucian canons. So what is the purpose and the function of Confucian canon? This is one. Secondly, I talk about the philosophy. Secondly, is performative and the Confucian canons. I think of canon. I really think canon is always a manifestation of power. And so we want to see how this canon plays a role in the Confucian culture. Then third things, is most things I'm interested about to think about. There is a tension through the Chinese history between canon, or we can say classics, and another school of thought. So how do we solve this tension, perhaps to give us some help to solve our problem we're facing? All right, so Confucius, I like to start Confucius because he's the most important person in Chinese history and the philosophical tradition. However, when Confucius defined himself, who is Confucian? He defined himself as a transmitter, not a creator. So believe in and loving in the ancients. So this implies that basic Confucian's intention is transmitting and preserving the traditions. So, and he always trying to teaching and inspire his followers to learn about ancient ideas and through learning and practice classical text. So storyteller Confucius added the 6 classics, basic text. And also this become a radical programs to design to really reanimated past. Now, so this is first this Confucius edited the 6 text. This is odes. It's primarily, it's about the inspirations. And secondly, the text is documents. It's talk about history and about human events, human affairs. The next book is Book of Changes, Jing, and talk about the movement, transformations of reality and the cosmos. And there is another one is Rights, and it's dealing with human actions. What is a proper behavior code? Another one is a Spring and Autumn Annuals. It's talk about the governance. What is the best way to be leaders? So this is the 5 classics. This is a 5 textbook before Confucius time. It's just being circulated around, and the Confucius picked them up, edited, and and then centralize it, become very important text. Now, this whole text in Chinese words is Jing. So Chinese, literally mean the Jing. One way you look at it is classics. This is parallels the evolution word of Santra in Indian tradition, or probably we think about its connecting thread. So the English word text derived from Latin meaning and woven. Now, in here, in Chinese also, looking back to the history, the Jing is a thread that bound the bamboo scripts together, because before paintings, all the human intellectual creations, ideas is inscribed in bamboo strip. That's one kind. Then deluxe version is written in silk. Now, to connecting them together, then use this term called the Jing. However, this Jing's meanings being extended. So Jing become in earliest Chinese dictionary, 说文解字 become waving. So this sense of waving is really recall the early view that these classics are not only tidily woven text, but also texts that weaving together the consistent principles underlying the social cosmical fabric. So we can see this weaving, this Jing become a fixed, somewhat a fixed framework for this society. And these classics also impacts a definition, order, and the unity over the long course of history. This is one step that Confucius come up with these 5 classics. But also next step we see in another Confucian, important Confucian name is Zhu Xi. And he basically picking up another 4 important texts. It's Analytic, usually we see called Confucius saying. It's basically saying and the brief dialogues of Confucius and his immediate disciples. And a great learning. So it's opening statement by Confucius with the commentaries on it by his disciples, 政治, and the means discussion of ethics and metaphysics by Zishi, who was both Confucius' grandson and a student of Zhenzi. Then there is Mencius, the saying and the dialogues of Mencius, who was disciple of Zishi. So basically 5 classics is become very difficult. Now the Confucian Zhu Xi make it more easier come up with these 4 books. It's much easier to learn, to grasp. And then this 4 books and the 5 classics become a very official, the Confucian canon. And what is the purpose and also function, goals of a canon? This text, what it's all about. Basically, we can see there is 3 things we can see: formulating canonical principles, and then also managing political affairs, and becoming a moral person, teaching people how to be a better person. So ethical, so you can see the basic Confucian outlooks the world, and dealing with human beings to another others, one and others, social event, and also self-cultivation, ethical codes. So they basically, this is a goal, ultimate goal is human beings will be able to realize the perfection out of finite existence of mankind. So it's transmitting from past to present and move to future. Now, of course, the question is, well, is this doing philosophy, right? This is a huge discussion. You're learning Jing is a part of, become philosopher or doing philosophy. So I think that's a huge debate, has been started, 19th century to now. But I do want to see very interesting ideas here is from in Confucian's mind, the best road to original teaching of ancient the sage and the king is to learn this Jing. This is one point. But another very important point in Chinese philosophy is about teaching someone to make a best decision or to formulating best judgment at a specific situations. Not about, formulating abstract reasoning or lofty rationality. So this is also like a philosophy as a discord. And we see this in European philosophy. So then also, if we think about philosophy is about formulating a judgment, then the most effective way to materialize this robust inspirations is through narrative, through learning the stories. So absorbing many historical narratives and will enhance this central ability. Now, but what is happening if we see Confucius just come up with these 4 books and 5 classics? But there is crucial point in here. There in Han Dynasty, when China being unified, then come up there is a state-sponsored classical learning. So Confucius become an official learning in Han Dynasty. This has the political, social reasons. And so basically, the idea, the vision is to bring community and the tradition together through this dedication to improve state policy. So then you're able to do is add the leaders, educate the people. Because what is important, the past event could really inform present predicaments. So this point I will talk about later. So in here, we can see in Chinese culture, always the case, personal choice between competing priorities and also internal self-cultivation. And it's always going hand to hand with the improvement of community and the society through benevolent government. So there are 2 things, personal interest and the well-being in the community, always interconnected. And now there is one particular, we say, structure enable Confucian, these 4 books, Confucian Canons, transmitted through the history. This is, Chinese have this called the Keji, in the civil service examination. This examination is basically the selection of governors and select political leaders, then you have to take this exam. This exam purely based on Confucian canons. So basically you have to commentary on these Confucian sayings. And so this is also the a all schools training curriculum. And even at the level of village school of course, this is only for young, or only for men. So, but the training started very early to young boys. Now you can see this examination started in the bottom. There is 4 levels. There is college, actually it's counting exams, township exams, and conference exams, and the highest one county exams. So some exam happened every year, some exam happened every 2 years or every 3 years. Through this exam, you have highest marks at the exam, then you'll be given political positions. Now, this examination, really because you encouraged people to learn from early age through your adulthood. And then you really also offer, you're rewarded by this kind of learning, right? Through going through this learning process. And they become, so they really formed a man of letters. This is for 1,300 years. This is, think about century-old system. And so basically, you can see how this is shaped fabric of society and the intellectual life too. Now, although, so this is, now we come to the third question. You have this canon learning, but also another word we call it the masters. There is another school's learning. Another word in Chinese history, Chinese tradition, Confucius is not only one thought, right? In the early time, we will see that there is a golden age of Chinese philosophy. This is from 6th century, roughly 221 BC. This is a time usually being described as contention of 100 school of thought. And then we can see historians define this, Liu Xin defined it, and actually particularly describe what are 100 schools. So you have Confucians, the Mohists, the Taoists, the Legalists, yin-yang thinking, the Sophists, diplomats, miscellaneous, masters, storytellers. So in other words, there is in Chinese history, we will see there's numerous approaches and the perspectives to social, political, personal, and then we see cosmic issues. So this period of time, they also call this 100 flowers blossom. And however, what happened to this golden stage of philosophy, right? So early times when they hold this school, they do think it's an interesting part of this idea of a canon, this idea of the Jing, it being respected by all schools. However, there's many Jings, not just one, right? So in the early time, you think in order to study Confucian, in order to understand the Jing, then you need to learn all kinds different texts. But the Confucians established the Confucian official learning really changed the situation. So basically, if you will see this Confucian texts are converted to salary-making, professionalized career. And then the other schools of thought were marginalized. But however, they are not they are not maybe become not in the curriculum, but they penetrate the Chinese culture in different way, influence people's life, like a Taoist teaching, a Chinese medicine, Chinese art, Chinese cooking, so forth. So then you can see there is a different way going. But I also think it's very interesting to see how political power can shape canon, right? And so what happened let's look at in the history, in situation history in China, intellectual history, we will see many political leaders actually have learned a non-Confucian thinkings, and they found out that non-Confucian thinking is actually more effective to ruling emperor. So we can see many emperors have favored Taoist text, favored Buddhist teachings. But also there's another thing is many literates, losers, I call losers because just for fun of it, because you can see there is so many people going into text to the examination, but only one or two on the top. What happened to rest of it didn't pass? What happened to those who doesn't have a political positions, not being awarded political positions, but yet they are very well educated. So they actually found their way. Many of them turn into Taoism and Buddhism to developing and excel their own intellectual knowledge and the talent. Now, this is also come out, another questions is different philosophical methodology. So one we will see is in a Canyon learning. Then you have commentaries, annotations of canons. They usually in Chinese tradition, they talk about it. You have canon, you have commentary, annotation, explanation. There is, in Chinese history, because it's a consistent continuity, this intellectual tradition, they have canons, but there is a hundred of commentaries of canons. So you learn, you not just learn canon itself, you have to learn commentary and the commentary and the commentary. So, so this is very interesting, right? So this commentary tradition, that's one aspect of this transmitting canons. Another thing, also in the canon area, there are emulations of great masters. So this is the idea, how about another schools, Taoist, Moist, legalists. So they are transmitted through the masters kind of relationship with the disciples, or they form up their own tradition. But this tradition is not being officially accepted, but also not being financially rewarded in situation. So this has come up also how we doing how approach in history, Chinese history. They also have this debate, hermeneutic debate to look at how do we look at the canon, Jing itself as a closed book, and we through learning we can learn some of it, or they are universal text from which new meaning can spring to infinity. Right, or there is kind of a synthesis to carefully research into classical learning and on assumption that it matched to teach us. So what is here there, I think it's very, you can see in China, they think about you're able to learn Jing is they have this assumption, or I say thinking Jing can actually help us to solve all kinds of problems at any circumstances. So Do we have this kind of idea? Maybe we do in tree, right? So now here, let's look at the argument for canon learnings. Use Chinese as example, common store of knowledge, give you useful conceptual tool, right? And then also importantly have this create the intellectual continuity and share the concern in the tradition. And also we will see this whole canon learning really created, like, one thing you create a culture, a process, produce over again, and from generation. But so then you also have a sense of belongings. I think it's an identity issue, not just personal identity and cultural identity. So that's another for good or for bad, that this is, we make some argument can be given on both sides. But then another thing is the historical character, human experience, really also offered the entry point, right, into to learning about a tradition, or even to learn about the vocabulary of philosophy. Where you start, if you think about it, you cultivate a reflective mind, and you need to share the language and the terms and the concept, then perhaps learning Canyon is part of that. Now, one of the things also in Chinese tradition, using this interpretive tradition, they like to use a weaving analogy. So there is basically, Jing is a thread, and the way with warp or weft, it's another aspect, different aspect. But then the Jing is a weft and a thread, and create this structure, create this fabric. And then way is give you tones, some sort of decoration in some ways, right? So, so this is, they could contribute to tapestry of this philosophical landscape, but they are another contribution still under this framework. Now, this is I will say, come to the contemporary time, and that's why there is even right now current going in China called the favor of national Jing learning. Everybody gathers so hot, and revival of a classical text. And because they become proud to be a Chinese, right? Just as today, there's all kind of training centers to learn about the Guoxue. So we call the Guoxue national learning. So, so basically, tradition has been received, reappropriated, and reproduced within always current social political environment. How this is being done? Also, it is formed through process of education, the parents, teachers, the community, and always to giving, contribute to this whole process, shaping of a mentality of citizens and also nation. Now, in Chinese history, there is argument against this type of Jing learning. Even in the Han Dynasty, there's a Han scholar. He think about you only promoting the chapters and sentence to be a small confusions. They trivialize a great Tao. Now this is saying, I think there's different way. We're learning text, Confucian canons, or we're learning about the Tao, the way, the source of myriad things, source of cosmos, So that's two different paths, right? So then when we were thinking about the, Jing learning, to think about we through a learning canon, a Jing, to reach understanding, probably reach the great Tao. But this Han scholars thinking you can direct to learning through your own reflection. Now, so this is created, this question is called the contending spirit. So this is in Chinese. And one of the things, it's very certain to see in Chinese tradition, we see there is a critique in the Jing tradition, the Canon. How could we critique Confucian, 4 books and 5 classics? It's very seldom to see this critique. One thing I want to see is perhaps Zhuangzi, it's Taoist sage, and discuss the epistemological limitations. But in his discussion, he actually is present a critique, a voice to Confucian, this Jing tradition. So here is said, the Tao, the way has no any sealed borders, and the world has no eternal constancy. It is by established definition of this is and what is right that the boundary are made. So so you can see there is a boundary left and right, and this idea, and then you also you come up with the ideas, concepts to respond to this. So for here, so you probably can read, right? So that then you have, once you start a debate, then you can see there is alternative to always seeing human knowledge, something is remain undistinguished, unshowed. So he called the shadow of splendor. So Zhuangzi gave a many critique. His main critique is to think about the critique of boundaries. One go beyond boundary and think about the enlarged human horizon. So if we grounded in Zhuangzi's this kind of a way to think about the canons, there is idea is a wonder, right? Wonder, the heart of the mind. Wonder. So this is Zhuangzi's this critique mindset, and also he has this playful attitude. If you read his, it's always a story, and it's a mind-bending exercise, we see Yoxing in Chinese words is wonder's heart. It's really trying to against another kind of a hard mind. It's a biased and fixed high mind. So once you're able to have this openness to this wonder heart mind, then you can recognize how contingency, each person's views or perspectives and horizons, and how limitations of human knowing, and also can help to illuminating the black, like a blind spot, our own perspective. So here, the Zhuangzi trying to establish something, and to all warning us to cultivate wonder, heart and mind. Eventually, he defined as a heavenly wonder. Now, when heavenly wonder, then your heart and mind to be like mirror. You're reflecting and embodying all things. So in here, and think Zhuangzi has his warning, and to warning us whether one canon learning actually could fix us, and it could be limiting us. And then one's epistemological, ability should recognize our limitations and go beyond. Yeah, I think I'm just end here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Perhaps I will ask a quick question, Robin. Thank you very much, first of all, for the wonderful talk. My question is a little bit external to it, is how you see the feature of the mutual engagement between the Chinese canon or canons and the European or Western ones. So do you see these as, you see that the feature is going on so that there is a mutual dialogue, and so by reflecting on each other's canons, we can bring modifications to these canons. So dialogues implying that we still, however, keep the idea of different traditions which go on elaborating and revising their own canons, or do you see that the feature goes more toward the creation of a common, this is probably far in the future, but of a common, more global philosophical and intellectual canon now? And I'm thinking especially about how Chinese philosophy is being increasingly included in philosophy curricula. And I'm thinking, I have in mind basically only the United States experience here. So not only in introducing classes in Chinese philosophy, regular philosophy programs, but also in including Chinese thinkers in intro to philosophy classes or intro to ethics classes. And this seems to potentially lead to not only dialogue, but the creation of a kind of shared global philosophical canon. And you have definitely, I'm sure, thought more about this than I have. So what are your thoughts about this?
Well, thank you so much for this question. This is a great question, and this is a right-on question. So in the field, perhaps we call the comparative philosophy. How should we do comparative philosophy, right? So that's the one question. Let me start with this. You will see what the future like, the dialogue. So I give a sociological answer first, and then I give a philosophical answer first. So for this sociological answer, we will see right now, we all become global village. And so I see more and more young people, like in China, I see many people from Europe, Italy, German, lots, all kind, and Russian too. I'm teaching right now online the Beijing Normal University. And then I have a student from Russia. And I heard he has a million followers. So, but anyway, he started martial arts. But then, okay, so yeah, he's going from St. Petersburg to Shaolin Temple. Right now, he's on the trip. But anyway, so you can see the generation are really, they are learning. There is learning each other. There's a very rich dialogue that happens. So that's, we see this happening. Now, the second part is a comparative philosophy. How should we do it, right? There is, you comparative, you cannot compare apple with oranges. That's not a good method. Most methods is a question, what is the question here? And then we see how Chinese answer this question and how European scholars, European tradition answer this question. So we question driven and then have different solutions to same question. So we will see this. Now, but your question, do we going to have a somewhat synthesis and a creative new canon, right? But I think perhaps European thinkers, much easier to reach that step. For Chinese, it's very, very hard. I don't think will happen. They all committed to their own canons. I will see it's a strong, it's deep rooted in their education and the formation of their outlooks. I think it's hard to just throw them out to something new. They could do a new, but then they have this. I think we see this happens. They like to use canons, past the sage's thing, to justify their philosophical positions. Right? They using canon as actually justification. It's not their own formulation, their own views. There is some, but less, I think, but maybe more and more we see it. But definitely we see the better way comparative philosophy being done. I experience this every day.
Thank you very much. Any other question? I don't see Robin. Maybe I have a small one, or I don't know, it's a question or comment. I was really very impressed by your description of this Chinese tradition as a tapestry and as a necessary condition to be to be inserted in a certain way of doing, of thinking, like a very strong connection between past and present. And I thought it's a very paradoxical, but they have very different. We need also to be inserted in the tradition. So this canon serve for this. In order to be philosophers, we all have to read, I don't know, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, and so on. And at the same time, it seems like we in Europe, I suppose Russia in this sense, it's a kind of Europe. We have this necessity to criticize and to review our tradition very regularly. And as you told, right now, it's not the case for China. So what do you think? How it's possible for such strong tradition as Chinese to revisit boundaries, to revisit the tradition?
Yeah, so there is happened in Chinese history, the critique of, for example, Confucian tradition, that is the May 4th movement, 1919. But the critique come about is actually influenced by Western thinkers. So they call it science and democracy bring into China. And it's relatively very chaotic condition in China. So how do we solve this problem? So then they found the European thought that bring into China and then starting this kind of debate. This happens, and then there's a historical, but overall, this is very lacking the critique spirit, particularly European, like maybe Russian, like this kind of critique situation. I've been I also thinking about these things. They're lacking this is a critique. Well, I would say start because their goal, like Confucius, the sage of, this whole tradition, being concerned, being seen as sage, and himself saying, I'm a transmitter, right? That's his basic orientation. I'm not an innovator, I'm transmitter. However, the Confucius do have a critique spirit, but there's critique spirit, it's individual. I critique your action, you have a problem. Critique myself. I think in 3 days, 3 times a day, see what I'm not doing well. This is Confucian critique. But whether critique a system, social structure, that is question mark, right? Yeah, how that critique spirit will be cultivated and nourished, and that is the interesting question, you know. And also I have to say, in Chinese intellectual history, we always see the connection, union between political power and intellectual power or intellectual field. So that makes this whole thing more complicated, the sense of a critique. That's why also I into Taoism, Taoist philosophy, but that is really critique of voice, critique the problems from personal to social problems. I'm not sure can you see why Russian has to critique information, the tradition? Where is the source of the tradition? Why European has a critique? Why? What's the root of this critique spirit then?
I may suggest that it's philosophy itself. Like we are studying Descartes, Leibniz, and other people from early modern time and from later time as examples of making like reflection on everything, like making questions on everything, on past, on present, on future. And I mean, Russia is a very mixed tradition. I mean, we have very strong traditional lines and ideas. And if we are studying philosophy at university, we are studying European type, American type curricula. So we learn to make questions, to reflect, to criticize, and maybe it's this. I don't know. I suppose it's an open discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I invite you to stay till the end of the session. I understand it might be a bit difficult. So we go to the next presenter. It's Mike Beaney, University of Aberdeen and Humboldt University of Berlin. He will speak also about Chinese philosophy, but also about modern analytic tradition. Mike Beaney holds the Regis Chair of Logic at the University of Aberdeen and Chair of History of Analytic Philosophy at the Humboldt University of Berlin. And he is the editor of the British Journal for the History of Philosophy. His research focuses on the history and historiography of analytical tradition, with an active interest in Chinese philosophy as well and comparative philosophy. Thank you. Mike.
Okay, so let's hope I can play. I've done the share. Can you see?
Not yet.
Point, right, hold on, click on it. Here we are. I press share. It says failed to start. Please try again. Let me try again. Okay. Let's try again. I'm wondering if I'm doing something wrong.
Okay, it's
okay.
working.
That's great. Good. So I'll play from the start. Is that all right?
Yes.
Good. Excellent. Good. Well, welcome. Nice to see people. Thanks to Stefan and Silva and Daria for organising this, and to Robin for your talk. That's very interesting, and actually it sets the scene nicely for me. I'm glad we swapped the sessions. I think this will work quite well. I've actually slightly changed the title, so it's not just comparing Canon-Formation. So I've main title is Canon-Formation and Canon Expansion. So I'll be as much interested in the issue of Canon Expansion as Canon-Formation, and you'll see the connection in a minute. Okay, good. So here's the plan, very straightforward. little something about canon formation in relation to my work as the editor of the BJHP, then something about analytic philosophy, something about Chinese philosophy, and then this is the key idea about canon expansion, what I call the reciprocal canon expansion, using one to expand the canon of the other. So that'll be my take-home message. Okay, I have 10 more PowerPoint slides, so half an hour talk shouldn't be no more than an average of 3 minutes per slide. So hopefully I'll try and finish within the 30 minutes. Okay, so canon formation first then. So here's my own interest with canon formation. Firstly, through being the editor of the British Journal for the History of Philosophy, and I'm about to give it up. I'm sort of, handing it over to Alex Cohen and Sasha Golob, who will be taking over from me at the end. They've started taking over. So, but I've done it for 10 years. I'll say more about that in a minute. Secondly, my work on the history and historiography of analytic philosophy, and then much more recent, but I'm getting more and more excited about this, and I'm spending more of my time on this, and it's really exciting to hear Robin's talk about this, ancient Chinese philosophy. Okay, so here's the key connection then. The formation of the canon of ancient Chinese philosophy, and I maybe in light of Robin's talk, I should say philosophy as it's sort of understood more today and in the West. So not the schools of thought, the 100 schools of thought that Robin talked about, but kind of limiting those 100 schools of thought into distinct philosophical traditions as we might recognize them today. So what's interesting is that the formation of that canon occurred at the beginning of the 20th century, at the same time as the development of analytic philosophy and under its influence. So that's, I think, a very instructive, interesting connection, that the canon formation in Chinese philosophy occurred as analytic philosophy was developing. So that's what I want to say something about. So then that leads to my main point. So this is just the take-home message of my talk. So if you want to go to sleep after this, that's fine. This is the key point. That the critical investigation and expansion of the two canons, ancient Chinese philosophy and analytic philosophy, can complement and reciprocally encourage one another. So that's what I want to kind of suggest how that might work. So we have an answer about how we, can expand a canon by drawing on another tradition. So in a sense, it's indirectly answering Silver's question to you, Robin, his one answer. Not the only way, of course, to expand the canon, but I think a pretty good way. Okay, so I'll try and motivate that suggestion. Okay, so again, just briefly, it's a lot I could say about this. So when I first took over the journal, I did an analysis of the previous 20 years. And I have to say, to my shock, I realized that 50%, half the journal, was on just 7 philosophers. I call them the big 7. Those familiar big 7 of the early modern canon, in order of popularity: Descartes, Kant, Hume, Locke, Leibniz, Berkeley, Spinoza. And then if you add another 9 philosophers, and again, these are all familiar figures, mainly European, male, dead, white philosophers: Hobbes, Aristotle, Malebranche, Reid, Plato, Mill, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, you then have 2/3 of the journal. 2/3 of the journal are on just 16 philosophers. And I have to say, the only comment I make about the Journal for the History of Philosophy in America, more recently, they still seem to have 50% of the articles on just those big 7. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in the West to broaden the canon. So I've been trying to do that with my various colleagues on the editorial board. And I did a new survey marking the 25 years of the BJHP, so 5 years later, and the references are all there. And we have managed to get the number down from 50% to 20% on the big 7. And in fact, we've managed to publish articles on 82 philosophers and other traditions not previously represented in the journal. So I think we've made some big strides in that respect, with this notable exception that we're still not publishing very much outside the Western canon. So as it were, our next 5-year plan, if we can talk in terms of 5-year plans, is to try to expand the canon outside the Western tradition. And we've started publishing some very, very good, excellent, interesting papers in Chinese philosophy and Indian philosophy as well. Now, so then sort of picking up on Lisa's suggestions about how we can, what our strategy is for broadening the canon, I think the most important was having special issues. And interestingly, one of the authors that Lisa mentioned, Sabrina Ebismeier, published in a special issue that just came out in the journal on historiography, and we've got some special issues on women philosophers. One's been published, another coming out next year, and another one in progress. So we you know, by commissioning work, we can, and being proactive in getting work in these other areas, we can expand the canon. Also expanding the editorial advisory board, so letting people know that we're interested in all areas of history of philosophy. And finally, various forms of proactive encouragement. So the BJHP is the Journal of the British Society for the History of Philosophy, and one thing we do in the society has been encouraging work on outside the normal canon. So I think there's a lot that we can do, and we're on the way. But as I say, the key thing at the moment is to try and expand it outside the Western canon. So that's what I want to talk about for the rest of the well, in a minute I'll talk about analytic philosophy. Okay, so let me say I think I've got 3 slides on the BJ, the analytic philosophy. So this has been my main research area, and in 2013, and I will present it. So here's a performative canon. Robin spoke about this. This was performing the canon of analytic philosophy, a rather large book that I edited in 2013, and I think it marks the establishment of history of analytic philosophy as a bona fide recognized subfield of philosophy. So we have ancient philosophy, we have early modern philosophy. I think over the last 20 years, history of analytic philosophy is now recognized as a major subfield of philosophy. So of course, that means that we reflect on what it is to be an analytic philosophy. So it's actually that recognizing it as something that has a history is to form the canon. So I was very conscious as I was editing this book that I was in some sense forming the canon. In doing so, I think if I were to do it now, I do it rather differently. There are various things that I wish I'd had in the volume and so on, but that just shows how canons develop, and one has to rethink them, and they typically do expand. In the second essay of that volume, I actually offer an account of the construction, the historical construction of analytic philosophy as a tradition. Now, there's a lot to say about that. It's all, not all, but you know, a story is provided in that essay, but I'll just pick out a couple of highlights. The early construction. So one often thinks, initially one dates the analytic philosophy to the rebellion by Russell and Moore against British idealism around the turn of the 20th century. But interestingly, the word analytic philosophy doesn't really arise for some time after that. Russell talks of analytic realism, one talks about methods of analysis. Even with the logical positivists, you didn't really have a conception of analytic philosophy. You had the idea of, you know, logical empiricism and developing a scientific world conception. I think the first textbook, as we would now see, of analytic philosophy is actually Susan Stebbings' A Modern Introduction to Logic in 1930. She's a very important figure in the development of analytic philosophy. But even she doesn't use the word analytic philosophy. It's first used in Wisdom's Cambridge Philosopher's Interpretation and Analysis, and the first use that I found is in 1933 in Collingwood's essay on philosophical method. Interestingly, in criticizing analytic philosophy, often names are first introduced in sort of labeling the opposition. The Journal of Analysis was founded in 1933, and then analytic philosophy, when it first started being used for a kind of tradition, brought together 3 sub-traditions: logical positivism, the Cambridge School of Analysis from Russell and Wittgenstein and so on, and also the Lvov-Warsaw School in Poland. And that was what was seen as analytic philosophy, and that was expressed in Ernest Nagel's essay called Impressions and Appraisals of Analytic Philosophy in Europe, where the term analytic philosophy appears for the first time in a journal article. But even then, the term doesn't really catch on until after 1945, and here 2 key canonical texts that, as it were, set the canon are perhaps elements of analytic philosophy in Feigl and Seller's readings. But then it's seen much more as a method rather than a school. So there's a whole process of formation, if you like, of analytic philosophy as a tradition. So just a couple of highlights from the later historical construction. I think one can say that it really only gets consolidated in the 1950s. Several reasons. One, Frege starts being canonized. His works are translated, and then one, as it were, backdates the origins of analytic philosophy to Frege, not just Russell and Moore's rebellion against British idealism. The first history of analytic philosophy appears in 1956, Urbson's Philosophical Analysis. It's developed between the 2 world wars. But interestingly, ironically, it's actually framed as an obituary of analytic philosophy, saying this is what analytic philosophy was. We've gone before for it. Now we have Oxford Ordinary Language Philosophy. But of course, what happened was that Oxford Ordinary Language Philosophy got incorporated into analytic philosophy, and it expanded further. The Marymount Colloquium, a very famous conference organized by some French people who wanted to bring, French phenomenologists primarily, wanted to bring some of the Oxford linguistic philosophers to France to see if they had anything in common. Unfortunately, it was a bit of a disaster in that respect, but Ryle himself makes this distinction between analytic and continental philosophy. So the term continental philosophy is really first used by Ryle at this conference. It's used again by Mandelbaum in an address to the APA. And so often a tradition is formed in opposition to something else. So I think this was particularly notable in the case of analytic philosophy. It's in opposition to continental philosophy that it then starts getting consolidated. And unfortunately, we still have this massive rift between analytic and continental philosophy running right through today. But it has a historical source, and to understand it, to go beyond it, we need to understand its history. Dummett's work on Frege was quite important, not just for, as it were, helping to canonize Frege. I'll come back to that in a minute, but also, of course, we then have the center of gravity of analytic philosophy moving to the US with Putnam and Kripke and Quine and so on. So it starts becoming a much bigger tradition. So the next sort of interesting development then, before I turn to Chinese philosophy, is what several of us have called the historical turn in analytic philosophy, perhaps going back to the reaction against Dummett's rather ahistorical interpretation of Frege. Hans Schluger, for example, wanted to say, well, look, you've got to see Frege in historical context. And recognition that actually analytic philosophy isn't an ahistorical tradition. It also has developments and things change, and we need to understand it historically. I would date the real emergence of the history of analytic philosophy as a subfield in the early 1990s, where various books on Russell, on Moore, on Frege and Wittgenstein started to appear. And the history of analytic philosophy was then conceived as something that, in other words, analytic philosophy was conceived as something that had a history, and hence as something that needed to be told. Since then, of course, as I say, the field has been established. We have a new series on history of analytic philosophy, which I edit. There's the link, a new journal for the history of philosophy, 2010, and as I say, the handbook, which, if you like, marks the coming of age of analytic philosophy. And what you see, of course, is you've got a broadening of the canon from what you might call the big four, Frege, Russell, Moore, Wittgenstein, or the big 12, if you include people like Carnap, Ryle, Quine, Austin, Davidson, Dummett, Putnam, Kripke. And then what's very interesting is the way in which that's been massively expanded, as I think you'll find in the series, a Palgrave Macmillan series that I edit, including Bolzano, Stout, Susan Stebbing, the Oxford Realists, Scott Wilson, the Lvov Warsaw School, the Oxford Women Philosophers, Anscombe, Mary Midgley, Philippa Foote, and others, David Lewis, and so on. So there's a real sense in which the canon has now expanded in a very healthy way. We have a better understanding of it. Okay, so that's just very briefly about analytic philosophy. I'll come back to a couple of things in a minute. So let me turn then to ancient Chinese philosophy. So here's what's interesting. The first histories of Chinese philosophy were written at the beginning of the 20th century by two Chinese philosophers who were educated in the West, more specifically in one particular place, Columbia University. Dewey was the supervisor of Hu Shi, and then there's also Feng Yulan. Hu Shi's dissertation was the development of the logical method in ancient China, which eventually was published in 1928. Here it is, one version of it. And then he also had an outline of the history of Chinese philosophy. And then a little bit later, Feng Yulan, again, I have a version of the shorter version, Short History of Chinese Philosophy. First version, 1931. And then it was translated in 1952 to 1952 to 3. So those are the first histories framed by Western concerns. So they pick out who counts as a Chinese philosopher because of their dealing with certain issues that we'd recognize as philosophical from a Western point of view. I can say more about that in discussion. Robin's nodding, so she's aware of what's involved in that. More recently, very interesting, these are the two I particularly recommend, pioneering, as it were, from Western scholars, Angus Graham's work, Disputers of the Tao, and Chad Hansen's The Taoist Theory of Chinese Thought. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. And I say a little bit about this development in an account of the historiography of philosophy in the recent Cambridge History of Philosophy, if anyone's interested. Okay, so let's little bit more then about the Chinese canon. So this actually goes back a long way, not just 100 schools, but more specifically in the Han period, these were distinguished 6 schools of ancient Chinese thought. So I call it thought, not just philosophy. Confucianism, Taoism, Moism, the school of names, the Mingjia, legalism, and then the Yin-Yang school. These are the sort of traditional 6. Okay. And in Confucianism, you've got these key figures, right? So you've got Kongzi, Confucius, Mengzi, Shunzi, the Confucius, Laozi, Zhuangzi, the Taoists, Mozi, and then Han Fei as the key figures. Interesting, there's 7. Okay, we had 7 early modern figures. There must be something special about 7. And there's obviously, you can't have too few, and you can't have too many to make a canon that's actually manageable. And these are the ones that were particularly chosen, these big 7 of the ancient Chinese philosophical tradition, but mainly Confucians and Taoists, but with Mozi and Han Fei thrown in. I mean, Han Fei you can see as kind of, to some extent, emerging at the end of the Confucian tradition a little bit. Mozi somewhat rather different. Now, what's really interesting, so here's the start of the connection with analytic philosophy. What's really interesting is that there was also what I started calling an analytic tradition in ancient Chinese philosophy. Okay, combining the school of names, the Mingjia, and the Moists, the Mojia. Okay, and this is much more important than traditionally recognized. And I think this is what has been shown by the work of these people I mentioned, Angus Graham in particular, who first brought together a translation of the Moist texts, and including some of the school of names people, Chad Hansen in his wonderful book, Christoph Harpsmeyer, Chris Fraser, Karen Lai, and several others. They've done a great deal to show that there was this, if you like, native analytic tradition of Chinese. In other words, I call it analytic because it's concerned with issues of philosophy, of language and logic, a certain kind of logic, admittedly, but concerned with processes of reasoning, questions about the relationship between thought and reality, and so on. Something that we definitely, as contemporary analytic philosophers, recognize as analytic, as speaking to our concerns. And more importantly, that once you recognize that tradition, you see that some of the debates that were going on within Confucianism, within Taoism, and between Confucianism and Taoism depend on underlying assumptions about language and debates that were going on. So it's absolutely crucial, if we're to understand ancient Chinese philosophy, that we put the background in place, and in particular, these debates that one might regard as analytic. Okay, so these are very important, and more importantly, and this is the sort of key point, it's the use of analytic ideas, analytic techniques, analytic forms of thinking that have opened up these texts in a way that we can understand. So here, and I think this is well recognized, encouraged by Chinese philosophers themselves, that we can make use of what we've learned, what we've developed within the analytic, contemporary, modern Western analytic tradition, to go back into these texts, make better sense of them, and see the role that ideas and arguments then played in the development of Chinese philosophy. So I think that's really, really important. Okay, so this is my point at the end here, exploring this analytic tradition then in Chinese philosophy not only opens up, gives us a better understanding of Chinese philosophy, but also can expand analytic philosophy. It makes us question some of the assumptions we have as contemporary analytic philosophers. Are there other ways of seeing the relationship between language and the world? Are there other forms of reasoning? Analogical reasoning plays a much greater role, for example. And also, and I think this is important, it's sort of come up very briefly, but I think it's worth stressing in the context of our debate. The canon shouldn't just mean, Lisa made this point very well, individual philosophers. We tend to think the canon, oh, it's these guys, usually guys. How can we expand the canon? Let's have a few other people, right? The canon is also topics and methodologies and so on. And we need to recognize that that too has a canon that might need to be opened up and expanded. And I think certainly when an analytic philosopher tries to understand Chinese philosophy, wow, I mean, you really do have to try and expand, develop your methodology, and you see different themes and ideas coming out. So I think that's quite important. Okay, so here's the final slide then, just pulling all this together. And so it's rather depressing, I think, and Silver mentioned this, that he talked about the US but couldn't find it in Europe, that Chinese philosophy has barely registered in debates in analytic philosophy. A little bit more in continental philosophy, more perhaps in the States than in Europe, but I think it's really quite scandalous that Chinese philosophy is not discussed as much as it should be within European philosophy in particular. And we have the resources now to actually make a contribution to analytic philosophy by drawing on analytic philosophy. And when you look at the work of Angus Graham and Chet Hansen, Chris Fraser and Karen Lyon and many others, you can see the way in which analytic philosophy has started to contribute to Chinese philosophy, and that in turn helps us to think better about analytic philosophy. So, as I say, once we recognize, if you like, a certain canon expansion in ancient Chinese philosophy doesn't just mean Confucianism and Taoism stroke Buddhism, if you like. It also includes Moist, the Neo-Moist, the School of Names, and perhaps some others. That too can encourage canon expansion in analytic philosophy. Okay, and as I said, for example, appreciating there are different forms of argument. Analogical reasoning is the notable example, parallelism in argumentation. So here's just a few examples. These will be familiar to Robin and those who do know some of the discussion in recent comparative philosophy. In ethics, for example, a lot of debate about virtue ethics or care ethics or role ethics that have good sources or forms in Confucianism. Epistemology, a lot of very interesting discussion about knowing how, this classic debate within Western analytic philosophy between practical and theoretical, if you like, and perhaps more emphasis on practical knowledge, knowing how, but also maybe other forms of knowing. It's often called knowing too, knowing what to do in a certain situation. A whole range of different forms of knowing that you get in the Chinese philosophy. Understanding that, I think, can make a great contribution to epistemology. As I said, in philosophy of language and logic, different forms of argumentation, different forms of analysis, really interesting different concepts. I mean, that's always something we should be sensitive to. They are difficult to get to understand, but when we do so, we understand some interesting differences between their Chinese concepts and our concepts, and of course ontologies and metaphysics. Just a couple of examples. It seems to me, if you read these texts, there's all sorts of ways in which Chinese philosophy, thinking about Chinese philosophy, helps us think about our own and offer challenges to our own forms of thinking in the West. Okay, so this is the take-home message on which I'll end. Analytic philosophy can be expanded by engagement with Chinese philosophy, just as Chinese philosophy has been expanded and is being continuing to be expanded by analytic philosophy. So let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mike. So now we have the final part, our conclusive discussion. And again, Silver, I ask you to make comments and questions. And then we already have a small question in the chat. Please write your other question there.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. I will be very brief. I planned just to ask the same question that I asked Robin, which you briefly addressed in your talk. So if you see this mutual engagement of the two traditions and the two canons as having beneficial effects, but in the separation, keeping the separation, or whether in the medium run, you see something, the kind of the emergence of a single global tradition.
Okay, that is a very good question. It's something I have been thinking about. I've also been thinking about, to pick up on Robin's something Robin said about comparative philosophy, about what is the nature of comparative philosophy. I actually don't like the word comparative philosophy. That's why I partly changed the title. Suggest, well, here's one form of philosophy, here's another form. Let's see if we can see similarities and differences in this sort of rather distanced way. And I think Robin's answer was exactly right. We want to find a question, and then we look at different texts. There might be all sorts of different texts that maybe answer it or don't answer it in different ways. Let's think through the kinds of answers they provide. So, let's say, what are the different forms of reasoning that we engage in as human beings? Okay, some are codified by Aristotle, the syllogism. Some get codified later, in the predicate calculus, different forms of reasoning. There are forms of reasoning that are not exactly codified, that might be too strong a word, but there are certain forms of reasoning that are recognized as forms of reasoning that are thought about and explicitly used and appealed to in Chinese discussions. So let's look at those and see what's involved. So we're asking ourselves, what are the various forms of reasoning? And we can draw on various traditions to come to an overall view. That, I think, would be global philosophy, taking a big question that makes sense, as it were, just in virtue of us being human beings. We all reason and argue, we infer, we move from one proposition to another in some way. There are good bad ways to do so. What's involved in that process? And it seems to me all traditions have something to say about that. So let's look at what they say.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Robin, would you like to comment to this?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you so much. It's fascinating. I really gave me this question about the canons, your concept of canon expansion. So your canon expansion, this term, make me to think, is this for my, like, in certain ways, like for example, you mentioned Hu Shi, Feng Youlan, Graham, all these people, but if from Chinese way of looking at, they are not the canon's work. But for you, you probably feel, are you seeing this work, they are canons? So it seems your defined canon is much broader. So then that's the one. So then the canon expansion means whoever current scholar, if they can do some work, very solid and good, and then we can define them as canon. Is that how you define it, or how canon can be expanded? Rather, we see canon could be understand and solve our problem. So I'm using really Chinese mind to ask you that question.
It's a good question. So the first thing I say, and this was what it was exemplified in my account of analytic philosophy, is that if we're wanting to understand Canon-Formation, it seems to me that can only be understood historically. I'm sure everyone here would agree with that. Canon just doesn't, emerge out of nowhere. I mean, it has some sort of origin. In the case of analytic philosophy, one would say that 4 founders were identified: Frege, Russell, Moore, Wittgenstein, and then gradually, insofar as other people engage with their work, they get added to the canon. There's a story that's told about it, and so the canon expands. And once it starts being conceptualized as a tradition, it starts to be understood historically, and then there's an interesting coming together of philosophers and historians of philosophy in expanding the canon and looking at other people. So I've done quite a bit of work on Susan Stebbing, who is often not at all recognized as being in the canon. But if you wanted to understand the development of analytic philosophy as a tradition, then she played a far more important role, sociologically, if you like, than Frege or Russell or Wittgenstein or Moore. She wrote the first textbook and started promoting these ideas that other people then worked at. And so she played an important role. So, as we understand the historical development, we realize that other people played an important role. So we can start to, if you like, bring them into the canon and start discussing their ideas. In relation to canon, since I just picked up Chris Main's comment in the chat, so
Sure.
Can I pick up on that straight away, because it's very relevant to this? Weren't the first histories of Chinese philosophy date back to BC, before the Common Era? And the answer is, well, yes and no. Okay, this raises the question about what we count as philosophy, which is a question I think we're starting to want to push in answer to, in response to Stefan's talk. What counts as philosophy? Now, when I say that the canon of Chinese philosophy was only really constructed at the beginning of the 20th century, what I had in mind was this: that philosophy wasn't conceptualized as we would recognize it today before then. So the word 哲学, which we is now used for philosophy, was only introduced into China at the end of the 19th century, coming from the Japanese tetsugaku, which literally means wisdom learning. So it's when the Japanese were starting to translate Western texts, particularly Neo-Kantian ones, into Japanese, that they wanted a term, they introduced a term for philosophy, and that then gets translated into Chinese. So philosophy then, as Jueshi was understood in China at the beginning of the 20th century, clearly has Western connotations. And it's those Western connotations that were then used to select a portion of Chinese thinking from the past into a philosophical canon. Okay, that's what went on with Hu Xi and Feng Yulan. I think that's been expanded a little bit more recently. Okay, but that's what that's what my answer to Chris Main's question is, that the Chinese philosophy, as it's taught in the West now, has been canonized beginning with Hu Xi and Feng Yulan. And what's then interesting, as I said, that I found from the work of Angus Graham and, well, it actually goes back to Hu Xi as well, is that whilst the Chinese, as Robin herself very interestingly said, is predominantly Confucian with a little bit of Taoism, who provides some kind of critical reaction against Confucianism, right? But when you look at the history, there are this other tradition, in particular the Mohists and the School of Name, who are engaging in debates about language, which we should understand in order to understand the debates that were going on.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, please, could you ask your question and comments?
Sure, thanks, Michael. That was really interesting. I just, you know, this is just a sort of, let me invert the order. A comment, first of all, and I haven't spent any time with these myself, so I don't really have much to say other than as a remark, but Leibniz, Bayle, you know, early 17th and 18th century Western philosophy is full of references to Chinese and Indian philosophy. And then it's kind of interesting that completely gets erased as the history of philosophy is, you know, the canon gets written, these interconnections between different, that, you know, obviously arising from trade routes more than anything gets erased. So that's just you know, a comment more than anything. But the question was really about issues of intertranslatability because the languages are so different. You know, in your remark, just even the neologism of a philosopher in Chinese is, you know, is interesting. So how, I was quite struck by your comment that this category of knowledge, the knowledge to, as opposed to knowing that, knowing how, knowing to do something, is there in Chinese philosophy. How does that emerge as rather than, you know, because I could imagine a Western reader looking at a text and trying to force that into one category or another, rather than realizing, oh, it's a conceptual difference that might actually be relevant to us. So I just invite you to say a little bit more about that.
Okay, thanks very much, Liz. Let me take you up on your comment, which is actually a really, really important comment first. Okay, you're absolutely right that there was much more openness to Chinese philosophy in the early modern period, Leibniz, Wolff, etc. No, Wolff, poor guy, lost his job because he was sort of saying, look, the Chinese can be perfectly moral even though they don't believe in God. You know, he's often seen as a paradigm Enlightenment philosopher for taking that kind of attitude. And you're absolutely right that there's a very interesting story, and there's been some work on this, and I think more work needs to be done about the way in which non-Western traditions were excluded from Western philosophy. One might say beginning with Kant. Certainly when you get to Hegel, there's one would say overt racism there. Heidegger, Derrida says such things. There's no such thing as Chinese philosophy, only Chinese thought. There's a whole process that goes on of excluding Chinese thinking from philosophy. And very, very interestingly, that does correspond to what you talked about in relation to Sabrina Ebersmeyer's work, that women were also systematically excluded from the sort of late 18th, early 19th century. So I think we need to do more work on that. It's not the case that it's only now we're discovering non-Western philosophy. You know, it was there in the early modern period, and then it got lost and deliberately excluded. So there's a very important project to try and understand that and react against that. So that's the first point, very, very important point. Intertranslatability, yeah, I mean, this, of course, is the difficulty. And I suppose I find it worrying. It's a real obstacle when I want to convince my colleagues that Chinese philosophy is worth studying, but the media, but the concepts are so different. How can we possibly make sense of them? Don't I need to understand Chinese in order to do that? And the short answer is that now I think there's much more work being done providing good translation. So we're starting to be able to access the text in the way that we didn't have before. But also, there are certain key terms that have been taken over and people starting looking up. So knowledge is one area where there's interesting work. But let me mention the idea that actually got me interested in Chinese philosophy, made me think, this is something I can understand. And this actually is the term that Robin also mentioned, Dao, really the key concept, I would say, in Chinese philosophy, Dao, the way or a method or something. So Chad Hansen's book, which is what I read, his Taoist Theory of Chinese Thought, basically says that it interprets the Tao as a rule-following practice, certainly a linguistic Tao, a rule-following practice. And I'm going to exaggerate slightly, but it's there in the text. He basically argues that the whole of Chinese philosophy should be seen as a response to Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox. Now, as a grad student, I was obsessed by Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox. So when I read this, I thought, wow, here's this whole book on Chinese philosophy, which is a response to Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox. So I thought, wow, there's something in this for me. And there is something, you know, it's emphasizing more the linguistic aspects of a Tao, but a Tao is a practice, and one such practice can be a practice of using names. The question arises, how can we use a name correctly? Is it because it's somehow in response to objective features of the world? Is it because there's some sage that's laid down what it means? Is it through the practice established over many, many years, etc., etc.? One can see that these questions about what constitutes a legitimate use of a name, a rule-following practice, are discussed in the Chinese context. So it made me realize that, you know, here's the central concept of Tao. We can make sense of it from within Chinese philosophy. And I think the same thing could be said about many, many other concepts of Chinese philosophy. They're not so alien once we start to think about them, we seriously engage. And that, you know, it's not to say there's a simple translation, but it is to say that we can start to make sense of it.
Thank you very much. It's such nice discussion. Any other questions or comments, please? Okay, so thank you very much for all participants. It was very, very good panel discussion. Thank you, Stefan, Silver, for organizing this. Thank you, our guests, Mike, Robin, Lisa. So I would like to
And Daria, thank you for sovereign chairing. We were a bit afraid of managing both the technological side and the chairing together with our comments and my talk. And I also want to thank Silver briefly for encouraging me to commit finally to some views I had already expressed in discussion, and Silver said, hey, Stefan, you should talk about this on the panel. So also just to clarify that I did not just put myself on the list. This was Silver's fault.
Okay, thank you very much. And I suppose it's not the end. I believe we will have any type of continuation and projects, publications, and so on. So thank you very much again. And I stop here our session.